Hi class, welcome back. In this sort of first official lecture, we're going to talk about exactly what is a natural resource. Okay, well, if you go to the dictionary, you might see things like this: a natural resource, industrial materials and capacities such as mineral deposits supplied by nature. Or you might see the one like down here in the lower right, a natural occurring source of wealth, such as land or water. That's in part right, but I think it's missing something really critical. Okay, well, let's look at some discussion from a popular textbook. This is from Living in the Environment by Miller and Spolman. They say natural resources are materials and energy in nature that are essential or useful to humans. And they actually, if you'll note here in this figure, they start to bring in some other concepts that we're going to talk about throughout this lecture, including natural capital and natural services. So here we have natural services being those processes in nature, such as purification of air and water and renewal of topsoil, which support life and human economies. And then natural resources plus natural services together equal natural capital, and more commonly in today's in today's world, we call these ecosystem services. And we'll get into that history in a moment. But still, I feel like there's something missing in these definitions. These are sort of the earth providing things that are useful to people. But if we look at these pictures of natural resource, these are clearly natural resource extraction activities, farming, getting food. Here we have forestry or timber, mining, even laying down solar panels. And all these pictures, have what? Did you answer it? I don't know. I can't hear you on that end if you answered it. But look, these have people in them doing things. And I think this is a really important concept to remember, that and why we're going to approach natural resources as systems, and systems that contain both human and environmental components, or social and ecological or environmental drivers and factors all coming together. Okay. So I actually like this definition by David Harvey from this book, The Ways of the World. Harvey is a really influential human geographer, and we may read some of his work at the end. He focuses a lot on the economy, and so in our last section, our last unit, we may return to some of Harvey's work, or maybe see some lectures by him. But Harvey says a resource is a technical and social appraisal. This means that the materials and people become natural and human resources only when we possess the appropriate technology and social form to be able to make use of them. Uranium became a resource when and with technological advancements in nuclear physics, and people became resources when they were forced to sell their labor on the market in order to survive. This is the real concept of the term human resources and human capital, says Harvey. I used Harvey's example actually in the syllabus of this course. I think this is really important because, like I said at the very intro, there are things that we can't even imagine that may become resources, and that's going to be linked to technological and social changes. And we can't predict what those resources are going to be, but we can understand the types of dynamics, the types of processes, the types of questions that are fundamentally important about understanding how we manage those resources. And so, we're going to talk about throughout this course about systems and human environment systems. I've just depicted some sort of real simple ways to think about this. On the left-hand side over here, this right-hand image is a more complex depiction of a human environment coupled system. Comes from a very famous paper by Dr. Billy Lee Turner, who is actually my advisor here at School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, looking at vulnerability, which is something we'll talk about more next week. the point is, I don't want you to go necessarily, you don't need to memorize what's in this complicated framework on the right here. That's not the point of illustrating this. The reason I have these different depictions up here is because, as we read articles in this class and maybe in other classes that you've taken, you're going to see all kinds of different conceptualizations and depictions of, a human environment or a social ecological system. And they're all different ways to help our brains conceptualize, this interlink between society and environment. So maybe you see them as two boxes that are connected. Maybe you see as sort of the environmental sphere and the social sphere within it, and there's connections going across. Again, for ease of thinking as a conceptual tool, we think of these as a sort of two subsystems that are coupled. But the reality is it is one system. It's all out there. But we are going to be using these human environment frameworks, and you're going to be exposed to a couple of these throughout the course. And so I just want to already embed that idea of social ecological or coupled human environment systems thinking already. Okay. Now, I told you that we're sort of, nowadays we tend to talk about ecosystem services. And I think it's important to kind of have a little bit of a sense of where we came from through all things. And so this is a real sort of brief historical overview of the past couple hundred years, but how we went from natural capital to the concept of ecosystem services. And so in the 1700s and 1800s, economists, because they were largely the ones dealing with things like, thinking about how we use things like resources, they basically talked about production being a function of capital, labor, and land. And capital were things that were not consumed in the production process. These were often human-made things like machinery. Labor, well, that was human labor. And land was considered, quote, a gift from nature. And it differed from capital because people thought that they could not affect a supply of these gifts from nature. Now, why did I highlight people in red? Why have I put a little, question here, which people? Well, the reason I did that is because, as you'll see in some of this week's readings, the idea that we could somehow overuse a resource, affect the supply. I mean, this is not new. The ancient Greek thinkers, philosophers were already addressing these problems, but in terms of the economists of the time and economic thinkers, this is not something that they thought. Okay, and so I think it's important just to remember that it's not like, oh my God, all of a sudden later on in this time we realize this. But in terms of economic theory, at that time they did not think that people could affect a supply of these gifts from nature. Well, okay, so let's move forward into the 1900s. This production function just got condensed, just became capital and labor. And capital was any asset that produces income. And this could be land or machinery. It just all got clumped together. We kind of like even forgot about, land, gifts from nature. Well, let's jump forward in time to the 1970s, which is kind of considered, when there was a bit of sea change in how we thought. Okay, and at that point, there was just growing evidence and awareness that there were limits to the harvest of natural resources. If you go and look at popular titles of that time, you'll see things like, the population bomb or the limits to growth. Some of these are coming out actually in the 60s, but, the dominant mainstream society all of a sudden really started becoming concerned about population growth, over extraction. It was the dawn of the environmental movement, modern environmental movement. And so, this became this explicit recognition, sort of again, as natural capital. But now it was seen as a stock that yielded flows of natural services. Okay, so natural capital was a stock, meaning it was like a thing, a box, or a bag, whatever image you want, in which there were flows of these services. So the box or bag could be a forest that we cut timber from. That's the flow of services. Or it could be a reservoir that we get water from, the flow of services. And we're going to actually return to some of this thinking about stocks and flows and next in our later lectures on systems. But for now, you can just have that image in your mind of like a box or a bag of things. That's the stock, and then you have like a flow or a trickle of stuff coming out of it. Okay. Well, it got a little bit more nuance than just those stocks and flows. People started thinking about resources in really two fundamental different ways. You had stock, flow, reserve resources represented over here on the left. And these were things that could be consumed or depleted by people. I'm sure you've all heard, non-renewable and renewable resources. Of course, non-renewable resources being those things that that will not regenerate or replenish in human lifetime. So fossil fuels, they take thousands of years, millennia to be formed. If we use all the fossil fuels now, no more fossil fuels are going to be produced in our lifetimes, and even in our next couple lifetimes. Renewable resources, on contrast, will renew themselves. So if we harvest them at a sustainable rate, they will replenish. So you can harvest a forest at a given rate, and the trees will regrow, and you can continue harvesting that forest. Everything else being equal forever. Okay, so and then of course we have these fund service resources, and these are things that are not consumed or depleted by people. A common example from a textbook might be forests provide fresh water, oxygen, game animals. And so this is different than the example I gave before, where the forest was providing timber. And that example, that would be a renewable resource because we are extracting the very forest itself. But if we consider about the forest as a fund that provides things, it provides oxygen, okay? And using that oxygen, breathing that oxygen in, does not affect the forest itself. It does not consume the forest. But I put this little question here. Well, what about feedbacks? Because one of the things that we're going to be fundamentally concerned with in this class is this idea of how different things in the environment interact. And okay, so let's think about feedbacks. Well, okay, I don't know how much you all know about forest ecology or things like that, but if we think about the forest providing game animals per se, or you could even do this with freshwater, but those would go with game animals per se. Well, some of these animals, right? We might say at first glance, okay, the forest provides these game animals. I consume the game animals. I'm consuming something that's provided by the forest, but I'm not consuming the forest or depleting the forest. But those game animals could be very important for suppressing the undergrowth of the forest, which might maintain a certain fire regime, or it might maintain a certain moisture gradient or something like that, okay? And so by consuming those animals, maybe we're going to change some properties of the forest, which might actually then cause the forest to fundamentally change itself. So, I think we always need to hold any of these, really hold any of these examples or concepts, really think through them critically. But you will see in the literature these concepts of stock flow services and fund services from time to time, and I want you to be familiar with them. But again, the dominant language used nowadays is these ecosystem services framework. Okay, so how did we kind of get into the ecosystem services framework? Well, here is a timeline which has a lot of key events on it, and we're not going to go through all these events. This comes from an article by Gomez Bagthun and colleagues, The History of Ecosystem Services. And I'll actually post this on Blackboard, this article on Blackboard as an optional reading if you want to get into the history more, because it is very interesting, and you may want to know more about it than I covered here, but I won't make this required reading because I don't want to give you too much this first week. But essentially, take a look at the top here. Okay, and this is sort of a timeline, an interesting timeline to know. Okay, so In the 70s, the literature started framing beneficial ecosystem services and functions as ecosystem services to highlight that society depended on these. And so again, it was to sort of raise awareness in society. That was the original focus. But then, there sort of began to have a market, focus on this. These things can be monetized. And part of this came out of actually an early article by Costanza et al., which is actually here. So a little bit later, people started thinking about that these things could be marketed. You saw some reports about this. But man, then Costanza et al. In 1997, when you go and Google, do a Google search on Robert Costanza, and you'll find this paper. I haven't made it required reading because, come on, this would take you your whole life to read all this stuff. But they did this sort of big calculation for estimating the total value of the world's ecosystem services, and they came with this huge number that actually exceeded, the gross domestic product at the time. And people are thinking like, whoa, okay, ecosystem services, there's a lot maybe here. This could be a big economic, a big part of the economy and a big game changer. And so, this really started fueling the interest in evaluating and creating markets for these things. At the same time, all of this, started. Ecosystem services in the 90s started becoming a main focus in sustainability science and literature. And then, more recently in the 2000s, this really started, the concept of ecosystem services started to settle into the policy agenda. There were payment schemes, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those payment schemes are in a moment. Key reports, you're going to, in the papers that you're going to read this week, you're going to see references and discussion of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It's the MA reports, released in 2003, but the results made public, fully published in 2005. This has really, really kind of changed a lot of the language about how we approach natural resource management and environmental protection broadly, as we'll see. Okay. So what is an ecosystem service? This is the framework taken from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It is sort of the more common way to conceptualize ecosystem services. Ecosystem services, again, are those things that are provided by nature that benefit people and benefit human well-being. That's sort of a common definition. You can look at one of the articles that I've posted for you guys to read on hydrological services, and they're going to talk about the history of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. But what's important to note is that how they kind of categorize these things, okay? And provisioning services are those things like that provide food, water, wood, fuel. And this is classically what we thought about when we were thinking about sort of natural resources and natural capital. But ecosystem services have expanded the concept to include, regulating services, like things that regulate climate, or things that are even important for culturally. So you may have a forest that provides wood, but that's a provisioning service. But that forest also takes in carbon and produces oxygen during the photosynthetic process. So that's a regulation of our climate. And that forest may be a sacred site for some people, some cultures, or it may just be a place where you like to walk and it really calms you down after a busy day at work. And so that is a cultural service. And then, of course, we can think about another category of supporting services, like the cycling of nutrients such as phosphorus, which we're going to get a case study on later in the course, that are really important for plant growth, that help support many of these things. Okay, and so the ecosystem service framework kind of took the natural resource, natural capital concept and just really expanded it to beyond just things, to these important processes and relationships. So let's actually back up to this diagram that I showed you at the beginning, right? And so here we have natural resources distinguished from natural services. So, here, I don't know, here's a good example. Land being the resource. I think it's a little bit general. I would like to maybe specify a little bit more what we're talking about, but and then the service being food production or nutrient cycling. So these things, natural resources, and the processes, natural services, producing natural capital, which we now call an ecosystem service in today's language. Okay, so let's jump back to where we were. We were here. Okay. Well, when I went through the timeline a moment ago, I pointed out the fact that people started really thinking about the market value of these things, and that has really accelerated. That's a big topic right now: the valuation, monetary valuation of ecosystem services, and I think it's important to remember that this might be a very important tool to create a signal to care about things that we once took for granted. There's some popular environmental economists who have said things like, people think with their wallets, right? And then we've all heard phrases like that, and many times it's true, we do. And so if you realize, like, oh my gosh, there's a value to protecting this forest, like it's worth X number of dollars, maybe I'm going to protect it. And then, of course, I mentioned payment schemes, and you guys are I'm not really going to talk too much about them because you're going to read more about payment schemes in one of your articles. But these payment schemes, where can play a big role in poverty alleviation or world development, for example. And I really believe that, we need to think about, ecosystem services, holistically in terms of linking them to, the wider context, can they, the ecosystem service should not just be the ecosystem service, and monetizing it should not necessarily just be about conservation or protecting that forest, but it should be also linked to, holistically to things like the people that derive their livelihoods from that region and what's going on there. Is this an impoverished region in the developing world, for example? There are some challenges to that. I'm thinking specifically of an article by Kinzag et al., which maybe I'll post as an optional reading. But so you should know that all these topics are things that are actively debated in both in society and by academics, and there are no easy answers. And we're going to be exploring all of those dynamics throughout the next couple of weeks as we get a little bit more in depth onto specific cases, etc. But there's also some things that we really need to be, maybe some cons or something. Maybe I should frame that things that we should be cautious about in terms of putting a price on nature, the valuation of ecosystem services. Like we saw in that timeline, the early framing was meant to be pedagogical. It was more of a metaphor to make people aware of how important things were. And maybe the valuation has gone too far. It was never when ecosystem services were coined as a concept, people really never intended for everything to become market values or things like that. And not everything can be put into monetary values. Maybe, can you really put a value on a place that's truly important to you? If it's a sacred site, can you put a value on that? What is the value of peace, of tranquility and peace and quiet when you walk through that forest at the end of the day, walk through that public park maybe at the end of the day and calm your nerves down after a busy day? And of course, who decides? What should be valued and why? And does this account for alternative views? Not all cultures or not all people see things the same way. And what if we get the value wrong? Well, that's a concerning question. But these last 2 points are really what I'm going to kind of focus on in these next couple slides, because I think it's really pivotal to the way that we're going to conceptualize resources in this class. And that is, can we deal with complex interactions between different ecosystem services? And can we account for interactions between different places for cumulative effects? So let me give you some examples of those. Here's an example from the Skagit River, which is in the Pacific Northwest. This is actually where I did my dissertation work. This is not research that I had done. My dissertation work was on a different topic about collaborative governance, and we'll get into some of those issues later in the course. But there's work by Hood looking at salt marshes and small salt marshes and their value for habitat restoration. Is a really interesting case. So salmon are a very important resource in Seattle, both economically, right? Salmon fishery is quite important, and culturally, there's a number of tribes in the area who this is a very important cultural resource, and non-tribal groups also. Are many of them identified as sport fishermen or just like having salmon around. I mean, you can see here the Skagit River Salmon Festival coming up this September. Every year they have this salmon festival because salmon are just a part of the culture up there. And so Hood's research, for example, shows you don't need to know all these numbers here. I just liked his diagram, but basically the gist is this. There is more value in terms of quality habitat in restoring a large patch than there are in restoring many small patches. So he was looking at the number of little channels created when you restore these habitat patches, because the salmon right here, they use these little channels for their juvenile and brooding stage. And so, this is basically his point is this. 5 1-hectare areas have less habitat value than 1 5-hectare area. And you can see here, I've put, these are 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little patches or 1 big patch. So, how do you put a value on a hectare of marsh? Because that value is going to change depending on if it's 1 hectare in a big expansive marsh or whether it's 1 hectare isolated. And even beyond that, actually, there's changes, and this is not directly from Hood's article, but this is just you'll see this in ecology and landscape ecology across the board. Scenarios A and B have very different implications as well. The distance between small patches is very important. Let's move away from thinking about a salt marsh for a minute. We can think about forests, right? Distant forest patches are going to behave very differently in a landscape than close forest patches. So it's going to be harder for animals to get from here to here. It's also going to be harder from disease to get from here to here. So there's both pros and cons to having these different habitat configurations. And so it's no easy formula to figure out what is worth more. You got to figure out these spatial variables. Okay, well, let's look at another example. It gets at temporal variables. This is from a paper, kind of interesting, looking at nonlinearity in ecosystem services, temporal and spatial variability in coastal protection. But we already got some information about the spatial stuff, so I'm going to use this example to focus on the temporal stuff. So these authors actually looked at different intertidal habitats. Here we have a salt marsh, a mangrove. Here's some subtidal ones. This is eelgrass, a coral reef, kelp. And they looked at these habitats' ability to function as as protection from coastal waves. That is something we care about. I mean, storm surge or something like that it can be devastating to certain areas. It can really impact our infrastructure. I mean, we can directly think about what is the value of these habitats for protecting our infrastructure from storm surges or wave action or something like that. But the point is that coastal systems are very dynamic. You have high tides, you have low tides. At high tide, if you have big wave events, it's going to be very different than at low tide if you have big wave events, because some of these habitats are going to be submerged at high tide. They're not going to provide that buffering or not provide as much of that buffering capacity. You have temporal variability. Look, I grew up in the Northeast. We got a lot of salt marshes. In the winter, these things die back. There's not as much grass biomass, etc. So you have temporal variability in these systems as well. So they kind of looked at the value of these things, and their ability to sort of place a value really changed over time, depending on seasonality, depending on high versus low tide. So that's daily shifts. You have seasonal shifts. You could even have yearly shifts as habitats change. Compound that with some of the spatial thinking that we were just talking about a moment ago, and it gets really complex to think about how are we going to truly put a value on these ecosystem services. And the risk is, the risk is this. Like, I'm not saying that it's impossible for some smart people to get together and figure out a way to come up with a value, but it's going to often be very site specific, and it's going to be a bit complicated. And translating that stuff into policy is difficult. Policy and politicians have a hard time working with very site-specific stuff. What is the value of a salt marsh? Well, if it's going to depend all the time, it can be very difficult to create a market that's going to interact between, the entire country or things like that. And so I'm not saying that it's impossible to overcome these spatial temporal challenges in valuing these ecosystems, but it makes it very difficult, and it's unlikely that those complicated things that represent the more accurate value, I don't know if we can ever get it a true value, but it's less likely that those things get adopted into policy, because it's just policy often doesn't work that way. Well, one last consideration here is the interaction between different ecosystem services. And so here we have, this is taken from an article by Elena Bennett and colleagues. I know Elena from McGill, her research group does really interesting stuff looking at relationships in multiple ecosystem services. And this is just a way that they've started to conceptualize this, where you can think about how do different services interact, like is there a strong or weak interaction between them, and what is the impact of the driver on multiple ecosystem services? Is it like an independent thing? So here we have restoration leads to flood protection, which impacts crop production, or is it a shared impact, like grassland afforestation is affecting both carbon sequestration and it's affecting water quality? And so they were just able to kind of conceptually tease apart these different types of interactions, and just by sort of getting an idea of the different kinds of interactions that we could have, it helps us start to think about how we can better manage these things. For one, let's put the monetary stuff aside, just how do we manage for them? Because maybe we want to have both moisture retention and want to have wood production, so we need to kind of know how these dynamics play out, and of course then it could lead to better programs, to create programs for payment for ecosystem services, for example. A common phrase in the ecosystem service literature can even be it may be putting a value in creating a market for an ecosystem service without considering how it interacts with other services may do more harm than good. So this type of thinking is really important, and that's why, of course, you're going to read this article by Bennett and colleagues as part of your assigned reading. Okay, well, I've talked about some of the sort of ecological or biophysical spatial temporal interactions, but of course there's some moral and ethical stuff here as well. So let's take a reading of what Mark Sagoff has to say about the rise and fall of ecological economics, a cautionary tale. This is from the collection called Love Your Monsters. It's a published collection of essays that you're going to read a couple essays from. I haven't assigned you Mark's article, but you have the whole collection, Love Your Monsters, uploaded to Blackboard. So if you felt like reading Mark's article, you could. But basically, let's sort of jump to the chase here. We'll skip this first part and just jump in that much of the landmark environmental legislation of the 1970s, which had rejected a market failure theory of pollution, these statutes, such as the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, were intended to protect public safety and health against toxic wastes and hazardous emissions. The legislation rests on the same principle as common law, the belief that one person should not injure or invade the person or property of others without their consent. Understood in this way, pollution represents an invasion of a person and property and therefore is to be enjoined, minimized, or tolerated unwillingly until technology can do better. Environmental law is libertarian, not utilitarian, because it seeks to protect people and property against peril and trespass rather than to maximize utility. One person does not have the right to pollute and thus to trespass on another, even when it is socially efficient to do so. Economists, several important economists wrote in 1992 that, quote, the cornerstone of federal environmental policy in the United States explicitly prohibits the weighing of benefits against costs in the setting of environmental standards. Now here's the crux, or the important. By changing the political conversation from the question what is a cause of what to what is a cost of what, ecological economists substitute the technocratic framework of microeconomics for the ethical framework of responsibility. And I think this is, at root, sort of an issue of worldview or fundamental value. What should drive our environmental law and policies and our resource law and policies? Should it be based on market valuation, or should it be based on on ethics? For example, that nobody has the right to pollute water because everybody should have the right to safe drinking water. And these are real ethical questions that we need to think about, and we should keep in the back of our mind as we work with concepts like valuation of ecosystem services. So where does this lead us in terms of ecosystem services? Well, the ecosystem service concept expanded the concept of natural capital to focus not just on things but on processes, which I think is great, very important. Okay, and that's the mentality we're going to take. There's another component of the ecosystem services concept which has moved into valuation and markets, etc. And myself and others, my opinion is that this is not a panacea. Okay, that there may be times when these markets and values and monetary values are very useful and great tools, but they are not a panacea for everything. And so the valuation of ecosystem services should be just one of many tools that we use to think about how we value and manage our natural resources or ecosystem services. Okay, so let's continue on. There's a couple other concepts that we need to get at to address my original question that I started the lecture with, which that question being, what is a natural resource? Okay, well, natural capital has a very strong link with sustainability because we are concerned about, are we using this natural capital or ecosystem services sustainably? Well, the birthplace of sort of mainstream sustainability thinking was the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, in 1987, which really kind of was one of the initial big periods where we took stock of what kind of future are we creating, what do we want to create. And sustainability was sort of broadly equated with intergenerational equity. But we were kind of left thinking, well, how do we do this? Okay, and so two ideas have emerged, and you see these two worldviews or these two viewpoints from in literature, sometimes competing, etc. And so one was that we maintain total capital. Okay, and this meant that natural and manufactured capital are substitutable. The example being, you can cut a forest as long as we develop infrastructure, i.e., let's just say it's some kind of transport terminal where people bring goods and services, bring material goods, and they get shipped and shipped elsewhere, so that this terminal provides equal wealth generation in terms of jobs. Okay, and so that's considered weak sustainability. It's all about sort of wealth generation. The other idea is that we need to maintain natural capital, we need to maintain natural capital because it is essential for producing manufactured capital, and the two are complementary, not substitutable. So same forest might be very important for producing goods, but there are other things going on there, perhaps such as regulation of the atmosphere, that that can't be substituted by, manufactured capital. And this is the idea of strong sustainability. Okay, and so you're going to come upon these viewpoints. They're not always going to be called weak and strong sustainability, but you're going to come upon these viewpoints as you read the natural resource governance literature. And so you should have an idea of why these have emerged. And finally, one last way to think about natural resources is in terms of these three categories that I've put up here: private, common pool, and open access. Okay, and so private resources, or private property, as we might more commonly say, but we're focusing on natural resources here, so let's use the word resource. In these cases, individuals or companies own the rights to lands or minerals or other resources. And so they kind of control what's going on. They can keep others from using it. That's pretty straightforward. Common pool resources or common pool property are those that are owned by large groups of individuals, and they own the rights to those resources. And those groups can set the rules of use, and they can exclude access. And this is different than open access resources, where these are really owned by no one and available for use by anyone with little or no charge. And so like the atmosphere or groundwater supplies, okay, the atmosphere is not owned by anybody. And you could think about whatever use you want. Usually we use it to dump our waste, such as carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide. And this actually is what we term an externality, right? It's the cost of something that is, my driving around a car produces greenhouse gases and other noxious gases that get dumped into the atmosphere that affect everybody. Everybody bears the cost. I don't bear the cost directly of my car use. That's an externality. And and so, these concepts are another way to think about, categorizing resources. And I put a picture here of the very famous and highly influential Dr. Elinor Ostrom, won a Nobel Prize. She has unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. But you're going to read an article by Elinor Ostrom, and she was pivotal in sort of changing how we thought about these concepts of common pool resources and open accesses. And we used to use this common phrase, the tragedy of the commons, which refers to, everybody, it actually came from a common, Garrett Harding used the example of a pasture, a commons in England, and if somebody put their cow or their sheep on there, would graze, and they would reap the benefits. But if there was little, if they didn't put their cow there or their sheep, and they tried to conserve that, well, someone else might put their cow or sheep there and get the benefits. So why would I not put my cow or sheep there and get the benefits? Because of, why would I try and conserve it? Because someone else is just going to come and take what I've tried to conserve. And what Elinor Ostrom really came along and studied is says, look, this is actually common pool resources can be managed by communities. And there's a set of principles that she's going to talk about in her article, that relate to creating rules and norms of access and exclusion about who has rights and who doesn't. And really the tragedy of the commons, as we say it in everyday language, is really a tragedy of open access resources, which are very difficult to police. And so you should just have that little background in mind as you read Elinor Ostrom's article, because you should read it straight from the source, from Elinor Ostrom herself. But hopefully that little background will help you digest the article. Okay, so this week's readings, I mentioned that you're going to read the article by Elinor Ostrom. You're going to read an overview article about the nature and value of ecosystem services, which are going to kind of re-go through that concept and history of ecosystem services, and then present the case of hydrologic services, that's like a watershed, which will help you solidify your thinking about how this ecosystem service concepts work. And they're going to get into all kinds of questions of management and payment, etc. in the article. Okay, and then of course you'll also read the article, as I mentioned, by Elena Bennett and colleagues, which looks at interactions between different ecosystem services. I may put up another reading or some optional readings, in the next the next day or two if I decide that I'll probably put up some optional readings to expand on this, but I don't want to give you too much. But of course, as you read these articles and if you have questions, please reach out to me and ask me questions. And with that, I will sign off and enjoy your reading about ecosystem services.